I'd like to welcome Grant Hall, who's come all the way from New Zealand to talk about what happened under a regulated market over there. And I'm sure many of you were watching as that happened over the last year or two. And there was a time when regulation was introduced that they estimate around 11,000 people were legally consuming synthetic cannabinoids every day in New Zealand. Grant is both a founding trustee and acting general manager of the Star Trust, a New Zealand-based non-profit which advocates for drug policy reform and funds research into using psychoactive products as medicine. He's previously worked in the water and beverage industries across sales and marketing, training and business development, and he is somewhat famous for developing the world's first square biodegradable bottle and has travelled around the world talking about that. Please welcome Grant Hall.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. And can I just say, it was really refreshing when I was on the panel before, listening to everyone and listening to the questions and hearing people speak in these ways and these manners and these tones. It's like, we're breaking the taboo, aren't we? We're having the conversations that were pretty unpalatable, say, a decade ago, and that's really encouraging. And one of the things that I take on my travels around the world when I'm doing and dealing with people in drug policy reform is I try to encourage them and say, look, what's happening here at the edge, the fringe of the world, down in the Antipodes, we're doing some pretty cool stuff down here. And maybe that's because we've always been a little bit innovative. Maybe we're not subject to those old class systems and structures in Europe, I'm not sure. But anyway, this is where all the exciting stuff happens. And New Zealand has been experimenting with regulation of low-risk psychoactives. And we've developed a model that we think could be applied to any psychoactive product, even though, of course, we have this Misuse of Drugs Act, which perhaps was fit for purpose in the early 1970s, but I think we all agree, and we all now know, that prohibition in any form is a waste of time. I mean, let's be honest. The internet age makes prohibition redundant, right? Have you guys been to the deep dark web and seen what's available there? You know how that works? Well, it works, trust me. I mean, Silk Road 2 got taken down. Guess what? The deep dark web is bigger than ever. Silk Road 3 is very close. There's dozens of other marketplaces. So the whole concept of prohibition is actually fatally flawed these days. So look, I don't have my slides, but what the slides were going to show you was they're going to show you some raw data of what actually happened in a regulated marketplace, because New Zealand experimented with what they called an interim regulatory period, right? It lasted for 8 months, and then the government got cold feet because of all this negative media. I can tell you exactly how much negative media there was about regulations of low-risk psychoactives. There was about 3,000 negative stories in the newspapers, the mainstream media, magazines, TV, etc., about how bad and how fatally flawed these regulations were. And there was about 13 or 14 positive stories. That was interesting. Did that have an impact on political discussion? It sure did. And with an election looming last year in October, the government got cold feet. Basically, the opposition said that, we're going to suspend this until we've got these full regulations out. And so the sitting government decided to take the wind out their sails and do it themselves. And so the interim period was ended. So we had like 8 or 9 months. Now, during that period, as you said, there was about, we reckon there's about 11,000 people every day going into licensed retailers, and there was 150 in New Zealand. So before we had regulations start, there was about 4,000 or 5,000 shops selling, you've seen it, chronic, pills, little BZP package. You've seen all the rubbish, right? You know all about it, right? And then we had regulations came in, and that meant that all those corner stores, the dairies, etc., the superettes, they weren't allowed to sell them anymore. Only licensed retailers intended to be your head shops, Raythorpe, those sorts of people that were selling it, that met certain criteria, including the good character test and a few other tests, etc. And so all of a sudden, we only had 150 outlets in New Zealand selling these products. And then the products had to meet certain standards. They had to meet quality control standards at manufacturer. They had to meet packaging standards. There was no advertising. Advertising was forbidden in the store as well, okay? And then there was also some point-of-sale material that had to go out, some safety information, some harm reduction information. So all of that came in under regulation. And it happened, it went on for about 8 or 9 months. And as you said, 11,000 people every day, we reckon, were consuming these products. The media tended to focus on people that abused these products. So you've probably seen stories here where maybe and it tended to be people that were using them illegally, someone underage, 16, 17-year-old kid, drinks a bottle of vodka, goes and smokes some chronic, ends up in hospital. That's going to be front page on the newspaper. right? They're not going to talk about the bottle of vodka. They're going to talk about the empty packet of chronic in the corner. And this would be the cover story. Now, no one ever died, by the way, smoking cannabis in New Zealand, synthetic or natural. But you wouldn't think so if you read the press. It was pretty horrific, and I had some really great slides I wanted to show you on that one, but unfortunately not there. This shows us how much power journalists have when it comes to the drug policy debate. And whenever I go in and sit down with these politicians and I sit down and say, look, here's the evidence, look at what these scientists are saying, look at what these experts are saying, listen to what the New Zealand Law Commission said. They're reading the front page of the newspaper, and that's what's influencing them. So the journalists have got more power than the scientists. How are we ever going to change the law when that's the reality? And the journalists are only interested in sensationalism. I mean, the whole media industry is changing now. People aren't watching the news like they used to. And journalists are getting desperate. You know, if they want to get eyes on paper, I mean, paper that's fish and chip wrapping the next day, they've got to get really sensationalist. We're seeing this in the UK. It's horrific, some of the stories up there, and some of them just completely made up. So 11,000 people every day using these products. There were stories in the media about predictions of epidemic of addiction, all this fall, etc. What did the Ministry of Health say at the end of that period? The Ministry of Health figures themselves confirmed there were 0 official cases of addiction. There were 0 deaths ever. And yet in the same period, there was 3,800 Kiwis died from tobacco. 800 Kiwis died from alcohol. None of those stories ever made the front page of any newspaper anywhere in the country. And yet the kid that smoked some chronic, drank the bottle of vodka, he was on the front page of the story. So that's what spooked the politicians, and that's what ended the experiment, if you like, with the regulatory marketplace. Is it over? No, it's not. The government wanted it over before the election. They won the election. It's now back on track. And I went and had a meeting with them 3 weeks ago now, and I sat down and I said, how are we going? What's happening? Are you guys still on track with these regulations? And they are on track. And we're going to have this marketplace established again next year, but we're not going to see smoking blends. So the government has said very clearly that low risk doesn't mean smoking. So we're talking the sorts of products like a vaporizer, like a cannabinoid pill perhaps. Something like that there is what's going to happen. Can we get natural cannabis through this regime? I believe we can. I believe that we have to kick the Misuse of Drugs Act to the curb and start again. And I believe that all drugs should be treated and evaluated on the same level, by the same principles, on the same standards. I mean, if we want better public health outcomes, if that's the goal, that's the one thing that everyone will agree on. Even the harshest prohibitionists will all agree that we want better public health outcomes. And then we debate how we achieve that. If that's what we want, then shouldn't we be letting the scientists having more influence than the journalists? And certainly, obviously, that's my job as a lobbyist when I present that evidence. So how far away are we from having this marketplace? Well, I think if you were here earlier, you would have heard me say that in May, retailers are being invited to apply for a licence. It's not going to be easy to get a licence, by the way. You've got to pass quite a few tests, good character tests, history of fair, equitable trading, no convictions at all. Even drink driving might stop you from getting a licence. And then for a manufacturer, if you're a manufacturer, it's really, really tough. The application fee, by the way, is $175,000 to apply to get a licence to manufacture, right? That's quite a lot of money. Then you have to have a facility that's GMP grade. I mean, that's going to cost $5 million, $6, $7, $8, maybe $10 million. That's not cheap. And even then, you're subject to audits ongoing from the government to make sure that you meet those very, very high standards. Did we find that thing, did we? Oh, well, there you go. It was that well organised. And so no one in New Zealand has actually stood up and said, yep, I'd like to apply for one of these licences and manufacture on these low risk. No one's done it. And I don't think they're going to until we see the final standards around how do you evaluate low risk? What are the protocols for that? We think we know what they are, but we haven't actually seen them in writing. And it seems to me that the government are a little bit nervous about telling us what that threshold is. You know why? Because when they establish that low-risk threshold and they say, this is acceptable, if you can meet that threshold, you can retail it, you know what that's going to show? It's going to show what a farce it is currently with the Misuse of Drugs Act and the fact that you can buy alcohol and tobacco every damn corner store. Drugs that kill thousands of Kiwis and Aussies every bloody year. So those drugs would never, ever meet this standard, and the government are nervous about articulating that, but we're going to keep them honest and we're going to make them do it. And we're going to continue to advocate for them to hold all drugs to the same standard and to be honest with the citizens of this country about how to use them safely. So when it comes to regulation, there's no perfect solution. What I want to tell you is this, is don't let perfect get in the way of better. I mean, we know prohibition's a farce. It's a complete joke. People aren't going to respect a law that isn't fair, and that's why we break it. And how do we fix the law? Well, maybe we have to break it first in order to get it fixed. I'm not advocating that you go and break any laws, by the way. But I think it's fair to say that people here that are legitimately experimenting with psychedelics for their own personal journey, not causing harm to anyone else, should they be criminalised for that? I don't think so. I think that's a breach of their human rights. And that's why we actually need regulation. And that's why regulations ultimately will take away that sort of that social burden. You know, we don't want to be criminalised for experimenting with psychedelics. So regulations are important. You know, it's like I say, there's no perfect regulation, but don't let perfect get in the way of better. And I think that's probably a good place to finish. What do you guys think? Yeah, well, there's no doubt that natural cannabis is much safer. And so it's a complete joke that in New Zealand we're considering regulating synthetic cannabinoids, and we can't even talk about natural cannabis in a regulated way, even medicinally. Australia's ahead of us on that issue, that's for sure, which is a little bit embarrassing. But anyway. Because if you have a standard that says this is acceptable risk, right? If it meets that standard, then it should be treated accordingly in a regulated marketplace. If it doesn't meet that risk, then it perhaps maybe should be some form of prohibition or control, a harsher level of control over that product. That's what we mean by that. I think that what we're seeing with customs enforcement in New Zealand, and probably here in Australia as well, it's inconsistent. I mean, sometimes that product will get through no problem at all. I mean, I see that with the head shops in New Zealand. Sometimes, you know, Damiana, sometimes it gets fine, no problem at all. Other times we see seizures. It's very inconsistent, which shows you, I guess, just how poorly written and executed our drug laws are. Yeah, that's a good question. So the backlash happened 2 months out from the election. They cancelled what they called the interim period, and we didn't see what was predicted in the media, which was a epidemic of addiction, I think was one of the headlines. Okay, there was none of that. What happened was that the market just moved into the black market. So we went from this sort of white, grey market into a black market. So I've had media, people ring me up doing stings, going to tinny houses, buying synthetic cannabinoids. Next to, so you've got natural cannabis, synthetic cannabis, whatever else, crack, ice, whatever. And so people are now dealing with the, shall we say, organised criminal organisations, right, who are happy to meet the demand. So what we know about prohibition in any form, it doesn't change behaviour. It just shifts the supply channels, right? People are very innovative, very adaptable. If you want something, you'll find it and you'll get it. So what we've got now is we've got a product that's unregulated. We don't know the quality. You'll probably have situations like what happened with this gentleman here. We expect a lot more of that this summer because we know that these products are out there that potentially are much more dangerous, much stronger than what they should be because they're not regulated. People are paying more for it and they're having to deal with organised crime to get it. So we're going to have worse public health outcomes. And of course, there's no tax collected on any of those sales either. So in New Zealand, during the eight-month period, there was $140 million worth of products sold. So, you know, that's quite a bit of tax revenue on that. Now, what we understand, there's no tax being collected currently, so none of that money can be put back into health and safety initiatives. So look, you know, it's all bad news when you go with prohibition. Regulation's a little bit better, and what we're doing in New Zealand isn't perfect, but it's better than that still, and hopefully, you know, over time we'll get it right.
Thank you very much, Grant. Please thank Grant Hall.